It is June of the year 1815, and a fort lies under siege. Houses in the town below burn as men armed with muskets attack. Cannon shots ring out over the violence as stray horses gallop through the chaos. Then, the opposing force falls back, leaving the half-burned fort for the river. The next day, the fort, called Fort Douglas, would surrender. The fur trade was a bloody business, with various companies vying for limited hunting ground. Two of these such companies were the Hudson's Bay Company, which had a royal charter on land stretching along the Hudson's Bay, from modern Musconi to modern Churchill and extending inland to Lake Winnipeg, and the Northwest Company, which was based out of Montreal and used the Red River Basin, which flows into Lake Winnipeg, to hunt their furs. Our story begins with a man named Thomas Douglas, the 5th Earl of Selkirk. Lord Selkirk was a Scot, and by the early 19th century, he had attempted to help settle his fellow Scotsmen and women in North America. Selkirk had founded 2 colonies by 1808, one on Prince Edward Island and one at Baldoon in Western Ontario, and was looking to establish a third. However, most of Canada's eastern coastline had been settled, and there were not many tracts of land along the coast able to support a new colony. So Selkirk looked inland, settling on the Red River Basin. However, the Red River fell in the territory of the Hudson's Bay Company, or HBC. Selkirk began buying HBC shares, and the crippling competition with the Northwest Company, or NWC, allowed Selkirk to become a majority shareholder. In May of 1811, Selkirk was granted 116,000 square miles of territory, encompassing most of the Red River watershed. Today, this region covers parts of Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Ontario, Minnesota, and North and South Dakota. This territory was already occupied by various Native American groups and the Métis, the descendants of French fur trappers, and their native wives. The region also contained many NWC and HBC outposts. The HBC had dominated the fur trade for almost 100 years until the 1770s, when the NWC began to increase competition by taking away the HBC's inland trade with natives, as the HBC almost exclusively operated along the coast of Hudson's Bay. To counter the NWC's inland trade, the HBC had built Cumberland House on the Saskatchewan River Delta in 1774, and by 1811, the HBC had forts and outposts throughout the region. The Hudson's Bay Company imported most of their provisions from England. However, the Northwest Company relied heavily on locally traded pemmican, dried buffalo meat pounded into a powder and mixed with melted buffalo fat in leather bags. To procure pemmican, the NWC had many outposts in the Red River region, with the settlement of Fort William being at the center of the NWC's pemmican trade. In July of 1811, 25 Scottish and Irish families embarked aboard HBC ships led by the Red River Colony's appointed governor, Miles Mcdonald. They made it to the HBC colony of York Factory in September, wintering there. They left midsummer of 1812 and arrived in the fall at the colony site, at a bend in the Red River about a half a mile north of where the forks of the Red and Assiniboine rivers are. The settlers built a fort along a small stream, named Fort Douglas in Lord Selkirk's honor. Despite nearly starving in the first winter, additional settlers arrived in the spring of 1813, and the settlers began building and planting crops. On January 8th of 1814, Governor Mcdonald issued the Pemmican Proclamation to combat food shortages. The proclamation stated that no provisions were to leave the Red River Territory, but due to the NWC's dependence on pemmican from the Red River country, the proclamation went disregarded. However, Governor Mcdonald intended to enforce it. In March of 1814, the HBC would set up a blockade on the Assiniboine River to stop and confiscate NWC shipments, but the Nor'westers found another route, which the HBC also blockaded. This new blockade angered the local Métis, who offered to help the NWC attack the blockade, but this offer was declined. In June of 1814, the NWC's John Mcdonald met with the Red River Colony's Governor Mcdonald to try to work out a peace agreement and prevent further bloodshed. While both sides made some concessions, nothing major came from these peace talks. In October, Governor Mcdonald sent notes to all NWC outposts in the region to abandon their posts in the next 6 months in the name of Lord Selkirk. He then gathered and armed the local Red River militia. Mcdonald had invoked the royal charter of the Hudson's Bay Company, which he believed the NWC was violating. By 1815, Lord Selkirk was in Montreal gathering men to defend his new colony. He petitioned the British government for soldiers, but British commanders were reluctant to send troops to the Red River because of the difficulty of transporting soldiers such long distances. Upon Selkirk pointing out that the NWC annually sent large quantities of goods down to Red River, he was granted a personal guard of 14 men commanded by a sergeant. Then, Selkirk turned to the HBC, which was allowed to raise forces for their protection in their charter. Selkirk informed the king's attorney and solicitor general that he intended to raise an army and requested their approval, but received no response. Thus, he raised a force of around 180 Hudson's Bay Company employees and around 150 Swiss mercenaries who were veterans of the Napoleonic Wars and were paid out of Selkirk's pocket. William McGillivray, chief partner of the Northwest Company, had heard that Lord Selkirk was raising an army and intended to raise one of his own. The NWC force was mostly made up of former members of the Corps of Voyageurs, which was a military group raised by the British to protect water supply lines during the War of 1812. However, the HBC had also secretly recruited about 160 voyageurs of their own. Early 1815 saw NWC partner Duncan Cameron finally begin to implement the company's plan to force the Red River settlers out. In February, the Métis set up a camp on the Turtle River Plains and began harassing the Red River settlers. Along with the threat of war from the Métis, the NWC also offered colonists free passage to Upper Canada. This appeared to work, as many disgruntled Red River colonists left. Archibald MacDonald, in charge while Governor McDonald was away, threatened to use the colony's cannons to prevent them from leaving. As a result, on April 3rd, a party of angry settlers led by one George Campbell detained the officers in Fort Douglas's mess room, then broke into the warehouses and stole multiple artillery pieces, weapons, and tools, carrying them off to the NWC while the officers watched from the mess room window. Governor McDonald later returned to this predicament. The NWC's force under Alexander McDonald, which there are a lot of McDonalds and McDonalds in this story, however, it grew in May with NWC employees, local Métis, and Cree from the north. With this army, the NWC began to take action against the colony. McDonald, with a group of about 60 voyageurs and Métis, established a camp at Frog Plain, about 3 to 4 miles from Fort Douglas, and erected an artillery battery to prevent ships coming and going from the colony. On June 10th, a brief exchange occurred on the Frog Plain between several colonists and a party of Métis, but no one died. A canoe arrived that same day at NWC Fort Gibraltar, announcing the end of the War of 1812 and proclaiming peace with all the world, except the Red River. The NWC next made off with the colony's cattle. However, an exchange of fire occurred when the colonists tried to take their cattle back. Again, no one was killed. The Métis began to take matters into their own hands, with Métis parties singing war songs and dancing in front of the fort day and night to intimidate the settlers within. Some settlers were abducted, with their houses burned or dismantled. People were deserting continuously and often took arms and ammunition with them. Soon, another battery was set up on the other side of the river from Fort Douglas, and the Métis even occupied several houses in the colony. On June 15th, the Nor'westers attacked the Red River colony in force, taking many prisoners and building a garrison around a grain store. They also loosed the colony's horses, which subsequently trampled their crops. The next day, the NWC's Alexander Mackenzie and Simon Fraser arrived from the NWC post of Fort William and wrote to Governor Mcdonald that if he surrendered himself, the colony would be left in peace. Governor Miles Mcdonald then surrendered himself, making a verbal peace agreement with the NWC. However, the Métis rejected this agreement and resumed fire later that day. The HBC's James Sutherland met with the Métis at Frog Plain to negotiate a second peace settlement. Sutherland suggested that the parties live in peace, but the Métis rejected this proposal, and new terms were made that the settlers flee the colony, with only a few HBC representatives remaining. The settlers agreed to this and fled by boat toward modern Norway House under the guard of the local Cree. June 24th, the Métis burned Fort Douglas and a majority of the Red River colony. While the Red River colony was losing everything, however, Lord Selkirk and his army were just arriving.